everybody, I'm David Ansardi, and I'm your token male lecture video person for Bio 201. And I'm going to discuss anatomical position and body planes, body sections, and also some directional terminology that you'll need to be familiar with for the anatomy portion of your A&P courses the next 2 semesters. And you're going to use this terminology quite a bit. All right, so let's get started. Okay, first of all, what does anatomical position mean? Whenever you're going to relate 2 parts of the body to each other, whenever you're considering things like left and right, you always want to consider the subject that you're studying, the human being that you're talking about, and you think about them as being in anatomical position. So what does anatomical position mean? Well, the diagram of this person that we see here, this person is standing in anatomical position. And so what do we notice about that? The body is upright, face is forward, arms are being held down to the side, and this is really important. Notice that the palms are facing forward. Okay, so that also means your palms are facing forward. Then this side of your forearm is also facing forward, and that's very, very important for anatomical position and relating different parts of the forearm to each other. Because if you think about it, normally when you're just kind of standing there relaxing, your arms are hanging down, generally this side of your forearm is really facing more forward, and this side of your forearm is facing more to the back. But when you're thinking about what's in front or what's behind on the forearm in an anatomical context, you always want to think about the forearm being rotated so that the palm and this side of the forearm are facing forward. That's going to be important. Okay. All terminology relating direction or orientation between parts of the body is always going to be used with respect to anatomical position. Again, that includes right and left. So when we're looking at this person here in the diagram, this is that person's left hand. This is his right hand. Okay, this is the left side of the body. This is the left leg. This is the right leg. It's not what we're looking at as the left and the right in the diagram. So you need to keep that in mind as well. If you're looking on the inside of the chest cavity here, the left lung would be over here. The right lung would be over there. So it's always in reference to the person that you're studying. Okay, I said we were going to discuss some directional terms that are used to relate different parts of the body to each other. Okay, and we are going to do that. These terms are always going to be used in pairs with each other, and the first pair that we'll discuss is superior versus inferior. You're going to use these terms a lot in the laboratory, and you should get quite a bit of practice using them during this first portion of your Bio 201 course. Superior versus inferior. This is used to determine whether something is closer to the top of the body relative to something else or closer to the bottom of the body. Okay, and if something is superior to something else, it's closer to the top. If it's inferior to something else, it's closer to the bottom. Okay, the head is superior to the feet. Okay, that's pretty straightforward. What about anterior versus posterior and ventral versus dorsal? You can actually use those interchangeably. Anterior versus posterior, if you're looking at me from the side here, anterior means that something is closer to the front of the body. Posterior refers, as you might imagine, refers to the back of the body. Okay, and then ventral and dorsal can replace those terms. Okay, ventral and anterior can be interchanged, posterior and dorsal can be interchanged. So ventral refers to something being closer to the front, dorsal refers to something being closer to the back of the body. Easy way to remember that dorsal, if you think about the dorsal fin on a shark, that's the fin that projects upward from the back of the shark. So dorsal refers to the back. And then you just have to remember that ventral is the opposite of dorsal, so ventral refers to the front. Okay, and then what about this pair of terms, medial versus lateral? Okay, that one's a little bit trickier. With medial and lateral, you want to think about the imaginary midline of the body, which is nothing more than an imaginary line that goes right down through the center of the body. If you're relating two different things, if something is closer to that midline, it's medial, and if it's further away from that midline, then it's going to be lateral. Okay? So let's think about the eyes versus the ears. And then here's your imaginary midline, sort of kind of through the center of the body. I didn't draw that too straight. But as you can tell, imaginary midline here, the eye is going to be closer to that midline, so it is medial to the ear. The ear is lateral to the eye. Okay, so that one's not really all that hard. But notice down here on the hands, here's why knowing anatomical position, why that's so important with something like the forearm that you can rotate. What about the thumb and the pinky? Well, notice in anatomical position, the pinky is closer to that midline than the thumb is. So you would say that the pinky is medial to the thumb, and the thumb is lateral to the pinky. Okay? Proximal and distal. What do those two terms mean? Use those two terms to relate parts of an arm to each other or parts of a leg to each other. And they're used to describe the distance of something from the trunk of the body. Okay, so this main portion of the body where most of your major internal organs are located. If something is closer to the trunk than something else, it's proximal. If it's further away from the trunk, then it's distal. Okay, so on the leg, knee versus the foot. Okay, so the knee is closer to the trunk than the foot, so the knee is going to be proximal to the foot. The foot is distal to the knee. Just think about distal, distant, it's further away. Likewise on the arm, elbow versus wrist. How do you think those would be used? The elbow is closer to the trunk than the wrist, so you would say the elbow is proximal to the wrist. The wrist is distal to the elbow. And our last two pair here that we want to discuss, superficial versus deep. All those two terms refer to is how close something is to the surface of the body versus something else. So if it's closer to the surface, it's superficial. And if it's deeper inside the body, then it's said to be deep compared to something else. So let's think about, we got a belly button over here versus the intestines that are deeper inside the body underneath the belly button. So you would say the navel or the belly button is superficial to the intestines, whereas the intestines are deep to the navel. Now you can also use those terms. It doesn't have to be something on the skin versus something inside the body. If you're relating two internal organs and one is pushed up closer to the surface than another, you would say that internal organ is superficial to the one that's deeper inside. Don't mix up those terms with anterior and posterior. Okay, because if something is at the surface, it doesn't matter whether it's on the back of the body or the front of the body. If it's closer to the surface than something else, you're going to consider it to be superficial. Okay, next topic, body planes. And here, when we're using the term plane, a plane is a two-dimensional slice through the body. You can also refer to that as a section through the body. You can kind of use those terms interchangeably. And why do we care about terminology associated with this? Well, almost all of the views of a body that you're going to see in your textbook or on any of the common types of medical imagery are going to be two-dimensional slices or representations in 2 dimensions of some portion of the body. So you have to get used to looking at a 3-dimensional body from a 2-dimensional perspective. And again, medical images, x-rays, MRIs, CAT scans, examples of some of those are shown down here at the bottom of this slide. Those are all 2-dimensional slices or sections or planes through the body. So you have to get used to, you'll see these terms a lot, and you need to get used to understanding what they mean and then also interpreting them when you see them. Okay, so what do we mean by a frontal or coronal plane or section? So we got a person standing over here. If you take a body and cut it with an imaginary coronal or frontal plane or section, that is a vertical plane or section through the body that is dividing the body into a front portion and a back portion. And you're going to hear the term coronal quite a bit, but you can also call that type of section a frontal section. And these are views of the body that we're pretty used to seeing. Like if you look at this medical image over here, that's an example of a coronal or frontal section through the body. You know, and here's the right lung, here's the left lung, because remember it's the person we're viewing's left versus right. Here's the heart, liver. Some of these things, if you've already started working with your torso models in the lab, you might kind of recognize those. So those are pretty easy to recognize. Oh, I don't know how that got stuck in here. Sorry about that. Transverse planes and sections. If we look at our little diagram over here, this imaginary slice through the body is an example of a transverse plane or section. That's a horizontal plane or section. Now, images, medical images that you would see or diagrams that you would see that are transverse sections or representations of some part of the body, those are not going to look quite as familiar to you. You're not used to looking at the body in that type of view. But here's a medical image that is showing you an example transverse planar section. And notice down here they've got the spinal cord highlighted. Okay, so here's a 2-dimensional slice through the vertebra, the portion of the vertebral column that's located at this particular 2-dimensional transverse slice through the body. And you can see that this slice, which was probably located maybe a little bit higher than the one you're seeing there in the diagram, it has sliced through a portion of the liver. You've got the spleen over here on the left side of that person's body. And here they've highlighted the pancreas for you. And then there's the little section or the slice through the aorta that is extending down through that portion of the body. You know, so it's kind of like, I've got this little mini-me model over here. Imagine that you had a slice or a section that cut through the body like this. The body was pulled apart, and then you're just looking at the right on the end of the top half that's been cut open. That's more or less what you're looking at there in that particular diagram. So like I said, those are not quite as familiar to us. Okay, now what about a sagittal plane or a sagittal section? That's the third type. This is also a vertical up and down slice through the body. However, instead of dividing the body into a front portion and a back portion, or an anterior portion versus a posterior portion, a sagittal plane or section divides the body into a left portion and a right portion. So it's cutting the body like this. Now, if that plane is located right in the middle of of the body, it is referred to as a median plane or a mid-sagittal plane or section. But let's say that plane sliced the body over here or over here. You can still divide the body into a left portion and a right portion, but then you would just refer to that as a sagittal section. It's only mid-sagittal if it's right down through the exact middle of the body. And then here's an example of a sagittal view on a medical image. You can see there's part of the vertebral column, and they're highlighting here this particular slice through the body has cut through a portion of the intestines and the abdominopelvic cavity. Okay, and again, so think about a sagittal section. You're looking at something from a side view. Okay, so let's look at a few more examples and try to figure out examples of medical images and try to figure out what type of plane or section we're looking at. So what do you think this one is? So we look on here, this is a CT scan through the superior abdomen. Okay, so superior abdomen, that's going to be the upper portion of the abdominal cavity. And based on the shape of this section and how things are oriented, here's a vertebra, a backbone that's been cut through. Here's a portion of the liver, pancreas. Here's a slice through the left kidney. So basically, here's a portion of the spleen. So based on how these things are oriented, we can tell that this is a coronal. I'm sorry, not a coronal, a transverse section. Okay. And let's see, what about this one over here? This one's easy. You can recognize there's your vertebral column, your backbone. There's the left lung. There's the right lung, the liver. Here's a part of the small intestine. So based on the way those things are oriented, pretty easy to tell that that is a coronal section through the body. This one, you're looking at a side view of the head. Okay, so obviously with that type of view, the body has been sliced like this and pulled apart, and you're looking at an inside view on the right half of that cut. Okay, so what type of section is that going to be? This looks like it was cut right through the very middle of the body, so we would say this is a mid-sagittal section. Okay, one more over here. What type of plane or section of this? Now, they don't have to go through the entire body, as we just saw with the head, but hopefully you can kind of recognize the shape of a head here, and here's our two eyes right there. Hopefully that looks a little bit like a brain to you. This is an actual MRI image, and so obviously that's a coronal or a frontal view of the head. Okay, so finally let's put some of these things we've talked about together, and I've got 3 example questions here on this slide for us to discuss, and these are examples of some test questions you may have on your Unit 1 written exam using this terminology. So if you have a question like this, using a transverse plane, how would you relate the heart to the colon? Now, whenever you see this opening part of a question using a particular type of plane, think about that. It's not that you're viewing the body in that plane. You're not viewing that type of two-dimensional slice. It means you're actually cutting the body with that type of plane, or slicing it with that type of plane. Okay, so a transverse plane, that's our horizontal section like this, that's cut through the body. How would you relate the heart to the colon? Transverse plane divides the body into a top half and a bottom half. So we would say that the heart is, here's our colon down here. So you would say that the heart is superior to the colon. Okay? Then what about the second? When using a sagittal plane, how would you relate the heart to the right lung? So remember, a sagittal plane or section is a vertical section through the body that divides the body into left and right portions. What terminology are we going to use? Remember, medial and lateral, relating to things with regard to how close they are to the midline of the body. So there's your heart. Here's our right lung over here. So we would say that the heart is actually closer to that imaginary midline through the body, so the heart is going to be medial to the right lung. Okay? So that's not too hard. Then finally, using a coronal or a frontal plane, so that's going to be a cut like this, dividing the body into a front and a back half. How would you relate the nose to the ear? So looking on my head here, nose, ear, you have an imaginary slice like this. The nose is closer to the front portion of the body than the ear, so you would say that the nose is anterior to the ear. And then what was our other term for that? You can also say that the nose is ventral to the ear. The ear would be posterior to the nose. The ear would be dorsal to the nose. Okay, so that's just a few little quick practice questions from that, and that concludes this particular lecture video clip, and I will see you on the next one.